Ladies and gentlemen, there is a certain silence that echoes in the hearts of many, a silence formed not from peace, but from unresolved pain rooted in our earliest relationships. The wounds left by our parents, whether through absence, misunderstanding, or harshness, often sit quietly in the shadows of our psyche, shaping our adult lives in ways we seldom understand. But let us not forget, forgiveness is not forgetting. It is not excusing. It is a sacred act of self-reclamation. Today, I offer you 5 keynotes on how to walk that path, not to absolve others blindly, but to free the soul that has been carrying the weight for far too long. To begin the journey of forgiveness, one must first have the courage to admit that a wound exists. It seems like such a simple thing to acknowledge pain, but for many, it is the most difficult step. We are taught, often subtly, to protect the image of our parents, to shield them from blame, and to question our own feelings before ever questioning their actions. This conditioning runs deep, buried in the soil of childhood dependency. After all, our survival once depended on their approval, their care, their love. And so, we grow up believing that naming the hurt is somehow disloyal or dishonorable. But let us be clear, to acknowledge that you were hurt is not to condemn, but to validate your own humanity. You were a child, vulnerable, open, trusting. If those tender needs were unmet, if love came with conditions, if you were silenced, shamed, or made invisible, those experiences left impressions on your soul. They mattered, and they echo still, not because you are weak or stuck in the past, but because the psyche remembers everything it was forced to forget too soon. There is no healing without the full presence of truth. You cannot heal a wound you pretend isn't there. It is not enough to say, they did the best they could. That may be true, but it is not the whole truth. Your pain does not disappear just because someone else had good intentions. The child within you needs more than a philosophical explanation. It needs empathy, acknowledgement, and the dignity of being heard at last. Many people feel shame for still hurting, especially when the world tells them to move on or be grateful. But shame has no place in healing. Your emotions are not wrong, they are signals, and in naming the pain, clearly without blame or guilt, you take the first powerful step away from silence and towards self-liberation. This is not about dwelling in victimhood. It is about honoring the reality that shaped you so that you may finally step out of its shadow. Until you do, you remain unconsciously loyal to it, repeating its patterns, defending its pain, protecting those who once harmed you even from your own truth. But when you stand in your story and say, "This hurt me," you begin the sacred work of restoration. You begin to gather the pieces of yourself that were scattered in moments of fear, confusion, or rejection. In doing so, you do not destroy the image of your parents. You humanize it. You allow them to be both what they were and what they were not. And more importantly, you allow yourself to be seen, not as a reflection of their failings, but as someone worthy of love and understanding, even when it was not always offered. And that is where true healing begins. Understanding the shadow within our parents requires a deep and often uncomfortable shift in perception. It calls us to look beyond the roles they played in our lives: mother, father, protector, disciplinarian, and to see them as individuals shaped by forces we may never fully comprehend. They too were once children. They too bore wounds, navigated fear, and struggled to find a sense of self within the limitations of their own upbringing. So often we view our parents through the narrow lens of what they did or did not give us. But behind every harsh word, cold silence, or unreachable emotional wall, there was a history, a lineage of unspoken pain passed down like an heirloom. Many of our parents came from environments where emotions were a threat, where love was transactional, or where survival came before tenderness. The damage they caused may not have been born from malice, but from limitation, from the parts of themselves they had to abandon to function in a world that demanded their conformity, stoicism, or silence. To understand the shadow within them is not to excuse harm, but to comprehend its origins. It is to recognize that what was directed at you, anger, rejection, manipulation, emotional distance, often had nothing to do with you at all. It was the overflow of their own unprocessed grief. It was the echo of how they were treated, the residue of what they never resolved. Their inability to nurture you in the way you needed was likely the same void they experienced and never learned to fill. When we begin to see them in this fuller light, not as all-powerful beings, but as fallible, unfinished people, something within us softens, not in a way that invalidates the pain we carry, but in a way that gives us clarity. Their failures were not personal indictments of us, but reflections of their own fragmentation. The shadow they projected was not your identity. It was their own woundedness spilling over. This realization does not diminish what you went through. Rather, it adds dimension to it. It allows you to release the belief that you were unworthy of love, attention, or understanding. It helps you see that the emotional absence or control you endured was not a verdict on your value, but a mirror of their internal chaos. They were trying, often clumsily, to navigate a world with the tools they had, which were likely broken, dull, or entirely missing. There is a certain freedom in this understanding. It does not require contact, conversation, or reconciliation. It is an internal shift, a gentle pulling back of the veil that separates blame from insight. When you understand their shadow, you no longer need to carry it. You do not need to keep trying to win their love or fix what they could never repair in themselves. And slowly, you start to see that forgiveness is not a gift you give to them. It is the release of a burden you were never meant to bear. You stop needing them to be something they were not, and you begin the journey of becoming for yourself what they could not be: present, conscious, whole. There is a quiet but powerful shift that happens when you begin to separate the child within you from the adult you are today. For many of us, the pain we carry from our parents' lives not only in memory, but in the very structure of how we relate to others and to ourselves. It is the child's voice, longing, questioning, aching, that continues to echo in our adult minds, shaping decisions, reactions, and expectations. This voice says, maybe if I try harder, I'll finally be seen. Or maybe one day they'll realize how much they hurt me. The child waits still, hoping the story will end differently. But the truth is, the inner child does not exist in the past. It exists in us, now. And until we consciously recognize and relate to that child, we risk living a life in which our adult self is constantly hijacked by unresolved needs. We may find ourselves people, pleasing to avoid abandonment, raging when we feel unheard, or shutting down to protect ourselves from potential disappointment. These are not simply habits. They are survival strategies carried over from a time when we truly were powerless. To separate the child from the adult within you is to begin the process of inner differentiation. It is to gently observe when a reaction is coming from a place of emotional memory rather than present reality. The adult self can step in and say, "This pain is real, but I no longer have to respond from the place where I first felt it." This doesn't mean dismissing the child's voice. It means learning to hold it with compassion while also reclaiming the authority to decide how to live today. This separation is a powerful act of healing because it redefines power. The child depended on others for love, safety, and validation. The adult can learn to provide those things internally. The child believed they were to blame for the hurt they received. The adult can see more clearly, understand more deeply, and begin to place responsibility where it belongs. The child feared abandonment. The adult can choose presence, consistency, and self-worth. This work is not about silencing the inner child. It's about no longer letting that child drive the car. It's about turning toward them and saying, "I see you, I hear you, and I will not abandon you, but I will also not let your fear decide how I move forward." It takes time. Often the adult self is underdeveloped, overshadowed by years of unmet emotional needs. We have to nurture it slowly, intentionally, learning boundaries, practicing self-trust, sitting with discomfort without fleeing. We have to teach ourselves how to respond instead of react, how to choose instead of chase, and in this process, something beautiful unfolds. You begin to feel less like a victim of your childhood and more like the author of your adulthood. You start to inhabit your own life, not as someone still looking back, waiting for something to change, but as someone fully rooted in the present, capable of making conscious, empowered choices. This is where real forgiveness begins to take form, not as an act of letting others off the hook, but as a deep reclamation of your own agency. You no longer beg for closure, you become the closure, you no longer hope to be chosen. You choose yourself, and that is the beginning of inner peace. There is a deep and often hidden truth at the heart of healing. What we lose in childhood, we do not lose forever. It goes underground. It hides beneath layers of adaptation, self-protection, and silence. This is the gold, parts of the self that were once vibrant, expressive, full of potential, but that had to be buried in order to survive. When we grow up in environments where we are not fully seen, where love is conditional or inconsistent, we begin to sacrifice aspects of who we are just to maintain connection. This sacrifice is never obvious at the time. It feels like safety, like necessity, but over time, it turns into a kind of inner dullness, a feeling that something essential is missing. To reclaim the lost gold is to remember who you were before the world told you who you had to be. It is the act of going back, not to live in the past, but to retrieve the parts of yourself that were left behind there. These may be your voice, your curiosity, your boldness, your creativity, your capacity for deep feeling. Perhaps you were told you were too sensitive, too loud, too needy, too much, and so, to avoid rejection, you quieted those parts, wrapped them in shame and tucked them away. Or perhaps you were never told anything at all, you were simply ignored. And so you learned to ignore yourself, to go unnoticed, to disappear. But those qualities, those instincts, those sparks, they didn't die, they simply went dormant. They became the lost gold of the soul. And the process of healing, of forgiveness, is not just about letting go of pain. It is just as much about reclaiming power. It is about unearthing what was buried and realizing that those very things you hid are the keys to your authenticity. This reclamation is not always easy. The parts of us we suppressed were suppressed for a reason. They were once unsafe. When you begin to bring them back, old fears arise. The fear of being judged, of being abandoned again, of being punished for showing up as your true self. But the difference now is that you are no longer that helpless child. You are capable of choosing your environment, of protecting yourself, of honoring your truth, even if others cannot. You have become the parent your inner child never had, the guardian of your lost gold. And as you begin to reclaim these pieces, you will find your life subtly transforming. What once felt like depression may begin to feel like renewal. What once felt like numbness may awaken into desire. The world becomes more colorful, not because it changed, but because you did. You have brought yourself back to life. Reclaiming the lost gold is an act of deep forgiveness, not toward those who wounded you, but toward yourself for all the years you had to hide. It is a gentle acknowledgement. You did what you had to do to survive, and now you are free to live. You begin to write a new story, one not defined by your wounds but by your wholeness. And in that wholeness, you find what was always meant to be yours. Not just healing but joy. Not just peace but power. Not just understanding, but the freedom to be who you were before the world told you to shrink. That is the gift hidden in the pain. That is the gold waiting to be reclaimed. There comes a moment on the path of healing when we are faced with a quiet but profound choice: to continue carrying the weight of our wounds, or to finally set them down. This is the freedom of release, not forgetting, not denying, but choosing to no longer be bound to the past in the same way. It is the decision to stop giving our pain the power to define us, and to stop waiting for someone else to make things right before we allow ourselves to move forward. For many, this moment arrives slowly. We think we have let go, only to find ourselves replaying the same memories, feeling the same anger, reacting to new people as if they were ghosts of our parents. We imagine that if only they apologized, if only they understood, if only they changed, then we would feel peace. And so we wait, sometimes for years, for something outside of us to offer the closure we crave. But the truth is that closure may never come from them. Some parents will never acknowledge the harm they caused. Some are too unaware, too trapped in their own pain, too defensive or too distant. and the more we tie our freedom to their awakening, the more we remain imprisoned by their limitations. Release, then, is an act of sovereignty. It is the radical decision to stop expecting from them what they were never able to give. This doesn't mean you approve of what happened. It doesn't mean the pain wasn't real. It means you are choosing to end the cycle within yourself. You are choosing peace over proof, freedom over validation, growth over resentment. And release does not always look like reconciliation. It doesn't mean you must invite them back into your life. In fact, sometimes release requires boundaries. Emotional, physical, spiritual. Sometimes it requires walking away, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. You can let go and still protect yourself. You can forgive without returning to the fire that burned you. There is a sacredness in release. It is a turning inward, a reclaiming of the energy that has been scattered through years of reliving, rethinking, regretting. It is the moment you say to yourself, I no longer need to carry what is not mine. You begin to retrieve the parts of yourself that were bound to that pain, your joy, your trust, your creativity, your power. These are the parts that were trapped in the story of what happened. Release sets them free. And in doing so, you begin to understand that forgiveness is not a transaction. It is not something that happens when the other party finally meets your expectations. Forgiveness is a release of the internal grip. The tightness, the holding on, the inner contract that says, until they change, I cannot be whole. That contract can be rewritten, and you are the only one who can do it. This freedom is not loud, it is not dramatic, it often comes quietly, like the slow opening of a clenched fist. It is not always immediate. Sometimes it unfolds in layers, with tears, resistance, and tenderness. But each layer you release brings you closer to yourself. You begin to live in the present again, rather than being tethered to the past, and this is what forgiveness ultimately offers, not a restored relationship with those who hurt you, but a restored relationship with yourself. It gives you back your time, your energy, your voice. It allows you to feel deeply again, not because you have forgotten the pain, but because you are no longer defined by it. You will know you have chosen release not because the past disappears, but because it no longer owns you. You can remember without drowning, you can speak without trembling, you can love without fear, and that, more than anything, is the quiet triumph of the soul.